As countries of the world seek to continue ways of adjusting to the new normal of COVID-19, civil societies are also being affected in their activities by the pandemic as they fight for societal equity, good governance, and the cause of human rights. So joining us now for discussion on this is Oyebisi Oluseyi, our Executive Director, Nigerian Network of Non-Governmental Organizations. The network is an organization that has, for 28 years, focused on improving the operational environment for civil society and civic space, particularly in ensuring that there's an enabling environment for the work of non-profits in Nigeria. It's a pleasure to have you, sir. Welcome to the program. It's an age of the new normal, like they say it is, with COVID-19. Has this affected civil society work, non-governmental work, organization work, and advocacy, owing to the fact that despite the lockdown, the things civil society and NGOs fight for are still going on? A clear instance is the case of rape, for instance, that tripled during the lockdown.
Yes, we've also been affected as civil society organizations, and from the mapping we did as Nigerian Network of NGOs, of course, working with the ACT EU program, is that revenues are being lost in the sector. Just as other sectors are also losing jobs, we're also losing jobs in the sector. Plus also, we've seen a reduction in the activities of non-profits across the country. While some are reducing activities, some are actually cancelling their activities. There's also uncertainty in terms of our funding and also the sustainability of the sector. So while all sectors are battling with the impact of COVID-19, it hasn't left our sector also without its impact.
Yeah, I think, funding, which you have identified, is really a major source of concern. But is that an issue that will compel civil society groups in Nigeria to begin to think of alternative modes of funding? Because many of these NGOs that we see depend on international organizations for aid. And at the time of COVID-19, those international organizations will probably have other priorities. Is there any thought within your community about alternative sources of funding?
So pre-COVID, we've always had discussions around what alternative sources of funding are there for our sector. And it would interest you to note that majority of the funding that actually comes to support non-profit activities is actually mobilized locally from friends, from families, from the resources of founders. We've had between 3 to 4% or 5% of resources coming from multilaterals and donor organizations. So for us as civil society, if 95% of our funding comes from individual giving, it's time we work with government for us to incentivize individual giving in ways that ensures that when an individual gives to a nonprofit, they get a tax relief or a tax return for that. That way, we can already begin to have resources for helping our communities to grow and also for providing services that government would naturally not be able to provide because of the magnitude of the developmental challenges that we face in the country.
All right, 2 quick questions. In terms of support, is there a role for the government to play here? Because we do know that even some governments rely on non-profits as partners in development. So is there a role for government to play here? And secondly, which is the most important question really for me, is in terms of population being served by non-profit. If you look at the Nigerian space, what segment of the population would you say is most impacted by the struggles of non-profits in a time of COVID-19?
Yes, thank you very much for that important question. And it's one conversation that we would also like to sit with government and have, because our sector is impacted and we do provide services that now has also been very much impacted in ways that would mean that we have a triple crisis now, which is health crisis, economic crisis, and a social crisis. We play a huge role in these 3 areas. So if nonprofits are not supported to keep their doors open, we might have increase in the social crisis, which might in turn also create a political crisis. So as government are talking and trying to provide stimulus to medium-sized organizations or enterprises, nonprofits should also actually be factored into that conversation. And in terms of those that are really, really affected, what we are seeing from our work and from the research we've done as Nigerian Network of NGOs with the support of ACT program is that the elderly have been affected. Those that are unemployed have been really, really affected. Young people are affected. Persons with disabilities are really affected now. Women and also young people. And when we're about starting this interview, one of your colleagues mentioned the increase in gender-based violence, which we've seen a lot happening now. We need to find a way of addressing that. And in addressing that, you find nonprofits playing more in that space. And, we now need to think about helping nonprofits to have shelters for women who would like to move away from their houses or from their partners in ways that ensures that their life can continue without them having to think of how would I survive, where would I sleep, where would I go, since most times families don't want them to leave their marriages. But then we are seeing the realities of having a shelter for women who would like to leave partners that are, that are beating them or that are violating them.
I want to know the new systems which you put to work this season because of the new normal, because of COVID guidelines like social distancing and the like. I mean, have you been able to push your advocacy? And secondly, I want to talk about synergy between NGOs and the people. It looks very far off. What I hear the people complain about is, some NGOs are good, but some, they just take the money and they don't do anything. When are we going to have a society where, people will appreciate the NGOs so much, like in England, for instance, where you have charity shops everywhere, almost in every borough, you have a place where people can, put things they're not using it any longer so that they can sell and use as funds for NGOs. There's an NGO culture. People get excited and saying, I'm giving to my local charity. But we don't get excited that way in this country.
Well, I think we get excited, but it's been very much informal. And when you look at the UK, which you just cited as an example, it has an enabling environment for citizens to support nonprofits. And part of that is the fact that when you give to a nonprofit, there's this altruistic value that you derive from that. But also, more importantly, you see yourself as helping the common man. And there's also the part where whatever you give is tax deductible. That kind of environment is not in Nigeria at the moment, and we're working hard to start conversations, to jumpstart more national conversations around this, but also to engage with government and our regulators, and indeed the National Assembly, in ways that ensures that citizens can give to nonprofits and help nonprofits to be able to deliver many of the services that you've mentioned. Of course, we do agree that there would be concerns or there are issues of non-profit accountability and transparency. And that's part of the work that we're also doing as Nigerian Network of NGOs and the ACT EU program to ensure that the sector stays transparent and that we can collectively as a sector measure our economic impact also. Because when you look at the work that non-profits do, there are a lot of economic outputs that comes out of that has direct, indirect, and residual effect on the economy itself. While this program was going on, we talked about the aviation industry, the transport sector, and the tourism. There's a direct economic output of the work of nonprofits or activities that goes into these sectors also. So it then means that we need to find a way of ensuring that while all sectors have been affected by this pandemic, all sectors, both civil society, private sector, and government, must sit together to find a way of ensuring that we address the impact of COVID-19 on the country, the economy, our society, and also in terms of how, again, we do our work as nonprofits. And going quickly to your question around nonprofits or civil society and the people, the civil society itself is that arena outside of government and the private sector. So it still consists of people, it consists of associations, it consists of trade unions, and it consists of citizens themselves and the media. But nonprofits happen to be the institution that has majority of high profile within that family. So we still have that engagement as civil society. The connection with the people are there. But I think we need to do more as non-profits for the citizens to understand the ways we work, the ways we do our projects, the ways our projects are funded, and the ways we use the resources that we've gotten in behalf of the people.
Well, I mean, while it is true that, non-profit civil society groups can make a lot of difference in Nigeria and can work with government to move society forward and to even hold government accountable. Yes, we've seen some evidence of civil society groups working in some sectors strategically with government. But isn't it too much of an expectation to assume that government will provide the kind of support that you are asking for? And I ask this because generally the relationship between the Nigerian government and civil society groups has been largely adversarial. You will recall the NGO regulatory bill, which was the attempt by the legislature to put in place a federal agency that will monitor, control, and register non-governmental organizations. Now, civil society rejected that. Now, what efforts, is your body making to engage government so that there can be a consensus around a number of critical issues? Otherwise, when you talk about government, the immediate question will be, should government give money to people who will go and agitate on the streets and challenge government?
So, thank you very much for that question. And when you look at the civil society community as a whole, we're not saying we don't want regulations. We do have existing regulations that provide the basic minimum requirements for guiding and shaping the work that we do. From the 7th to the 8th and to the 9th Assembly, the proposals we've had on the table for regulating the sector, they violated a lot of principles around fundamental rights and rights dealing with freedom of association and assembly. And when you look at in other climes, the laws that they have to regulate the sector, they are enabling in ways that build public trust in the activities of non-profits, and that helps them to be able to mobilize the needed resources for their work. So we are not necessarily antagonistic of government. Sometimes the way we pass information or feedback, yes, we agree that we might need to improve on that. But feedback is feedback, and government must learn to listen to those feedbacks in ways that ensures that we're moving towards the same direction of ensuring we achieve the sustainable development goals or any national plan that the country has. So with COVID-19 happening now, we've seen other countries like the UK, the Australian government, and the US government providing funding to ensure that non-profits can keep their doors opened. The agitation that you mentioned are issues that we are providing government feedback on. For example, in a community where there's no water, we've talked to government to say this community has no water, and maybe government hasn't listened. And you would recall that within a democracy, protests are allowed, provided they are peaceful. So it's a way of gathering feedback from government, and for government to also make use of those feedbacks in their national plans, in state plans, and in implementing people-centered development in ways that ensures that people would not even have to agitate on those things anymore. So the work we do is very critical. While there's an economic impact to what we do, there's also the social benefit of what we do. And yes, should government be giving non-profits money? We do agree that sometimes our independence might be compromised if government gives you money. But this is a crisis, and no one prepared for this crisis. And we can only depend on government. For instance, the donor money that we receive, they are taxpayers' money from other countries. So why shouldn't our government also provide some support for us to keep our doors open, especially when we are providing critical services during COVID and post-COVID, and also pre-COVID?
Well, you talked about the negative impact COVID-19 is having on non-profits, and this is a global concern. But in my initial question, I was talking about population and how it affects the serving of those populations. And you did point out demographic of the elderly, the physically challenged. But I also want to know, in terms of location, geographical location in Nigeria, are we seeing any difference in the impact at this time?
Yes, absolutely. There's disparities in impact. When you look at pre-COVID, we had poverty more in the northeastern part of the country. And with COVID happening now, it has exacerbated poverty across the country. But in a population where you have, let's say, for instance, 50,000 people being poor, now with COVID happening, loss of jobs, loss of income and revenue, it means that the 50,000 would have grown to like 100,000. And in a state where you have like 20,000 already, it might have grown to like 30 or 40. So the regions where pre-COVID you had these issues would continue to face increase in poverty, while those also already a bit resource rich would also go into poverty. So we're seeing the deepening of poverty on the increase in places where pre-COVID those issues were there already. So in terms of population, you would still see more of this in the northeastern part of the country, while also remembering that that region already had poverty, plus also insurgency happening in that region. Plus COVID now happening, one can only imagine the level or the magnitude of trouble that we have in that region at this time.
I mean, we know that there are a lot of NGOs that hold government to account on spendings and the likes. I mean, what has been their effort this COVID season? Because there's been a lot of reactions raised as regards that. Some have called for an audit into how the COVID donations were spent and the like. Do you have any information for us as regards that?
Yeah, we do have non-profits working at this time to follow spending around COVID-19. And we've also seen some level of transparency in the use of these resources by governments publishing what has been received and how this has been spent. But we need to ensure that this is scaled and that we can have this kind of openness and transparency across the 36 states of the Federation. Yes, nonprofits are calling for that level of details in terms of what was received, what was spent, how it was spent, and the procurement process in that space. We continue to demand for that, though we haven't seen much of the responses we needed in that space. And the lessons we are learning is that the more transparent the use of resources become, the better for us as citizens and the nation.
Well, thank you very much for joining us this morning on the morning show. That has been quite enlightening.